Okay, we are live. And welcome to Pro-Life Thinking, a Life Training Institute podcast, affiliated with Life Training Institute, a podcast that trains you in how to make the pro-life case effectively and persuasively. I'm your host, Clinton Wilcox, and to my left, as I'm looking out at you, to my right, as I'm looking at the screen, Nathan Apodaca is here joining me. How are you doing this morning?
Not too bad.
All right, it's good to hear. Yeah, so ordinarily we have talked about certain arguments regarding abortion from the pro-life or pro-choice crowd, critiquing pro-choice arguments or defending pro-life arguments, talking about how to have discussions, things like that. Today we're going to do something a little bit differently, and we're going to look at some of the news items that have come to light in the past couple of weeks that pertain to bioethics. Ordinarily, we talk a lot about abortion. That's the topic that Life Training Institute usually focuses on, and that's definitely a very important topic. But bioethics has implications for a number of spheres, and so I think it's important to address those at least once in a while, although bioethics is kind of the general overarching topic that I tend to specialize in. But abortion is, of course, just one topic amongst many when it comes to bioethics. And so the abortion issue has implications for this first topic that I wanted to discuss. And I'm going to go ahead and share the screen so that I can show the articles that I'm going to be looking at here. Okay. And when this happens, this always reminds me of that scene in Spaceballs where they have the instant cassettes, and they're watching the movie to try and find where Lone Star and the rest of them are at, and you get this kind of this infinite regress kind of thing going on.
I was just thinking of that myself when I saw this.
Yeah, it's one of the greatest scenes in cinematic history. So. All right, so the first topic for discussion, and I brought this up from LifeNews.com, which is, of course, a pro-life news site. But the person who wrote the article is Wesley Smith, and he's well known in the realm of bioethics. He has a blog called Human Exceptionalism, and he actually quotes the article from the Wall Street Journal, but I didn't necessarily want to talk about the whole story, so that's why I just brought up the Life News story here, is because there's one specific aspect of it that pertains to the pro-life position. And so Wesley Smith here writes about Pfizer and their news that they have actually discovered a vaccine for coronavirus that they've discovered to be 90% effective. So Wesley Smith here writes, the news that Pfizer's vaccine is 90% effective has rocked the world. The company will be applying for an emergency FDA approval. And so here, this is from the Wall Street Journal story. A vaccine developed by Pfizer Incorporated, PFE 0.03%, and partner BioNTech SE proved better than expected at protecting people from COVID-19 in a pivotal study, a milestone in the hunt for shots that can stop the global pandemic. The vaccine proved to be more than 90% effective in the first 94 subjects who were infected by the new coronavirus and developed at least one symptom, the company said Monday. The positive, though incomplete results, bring the vaccine a big step closer to getting cleared for widespread use. Pfizer said it is on track to ask health regulators for permission to sell the shot before the end of this month if pending data indicate the vaccine is safe. The timetable suggests the vaccine could go into distribution this month or next, though U.S. health regulators have indicated they will take some time to conduct their review. So that's kind of the background of this story, that Pfizer has developed this coronavirus vaccine, which, of course, leads a lot of pro-life people to ask about the morality of such a vaccine, because as we've discovered, there are some vaccines that actually use cells that came from fetuses who were aborted. And so, of course, that leads pro-life people to wonder, well, if they use fetal cells in a vaccine, are there going to be fetal cells in this coronavirus vaccine? And if there are, does that mean that pro-life people are obligated not to take the vaccine? Well, the good news here is that there actually are no fetal cells being used in these vaccines. Wesley Smith here continues in his article, that's great news, but many pro-lifers have resisted taking any COVID vaccine if fetal cells taken from aborted fetuses were used in its development. So I checked. Pfizer's vaccine was developed using genetic sequencing on computers without using fetal cells. As a consequence, the pro-life Charlotte Lozier Institute listed the vaccine as, quote, ethically uncontroversial, end quote. That news may materially increase the number of people willing to be inoculated when the vaccine becomes generally available, perhaps avoiding a potentially explosive controversy over mandates that has been brewing in recent months. So the good news here is that this new coronavirus vaccine being developed by Pfizer does not use fetal cells. So you can feel free to take that vaccine when it becomes commercially available.
Right. And also, I would direct people to the Charlotte Lozier article because it is even more in depth than Wesley Smith's article. It goes deeper. It has infographics on how the vaccines are developed and where cell lines are drawn for these vaccines. It's a very helpful article for anybody who's interested.
Is it this article that pops up here, an ethics assessment of COVID-19 vaccine programs?
There is that one. There's also another article by David Prentice, was published originally on September 30th, but they've done some updates on it. And it's got a lot more charts and data for anybody who wants to look closer at that.
Okay, if you can send that to me later, I'll post that article in the show notes so that people can look this up for further information.
Right.
Yeah, and the articles here that I'm alluding to have also been posted in the show notes as well. So for those of you watching the live video, you can see that already under the in the where it says show more, and it has all that information listed. I already put these articles there, so you can look these up for more information to do more research later. And especially when it comes to the method of this new vaccine. Now, it's worth noting that neither Nathan nor I are scientists. We're not biologists. We're more like philosophy popularizers. We look at the arguments, we disseminate them, and help you be able to make the case more effectively. And so one thing to point out here is that the vaccine that Pfizer developed to combat coronavirus actually has a different mechanism than the one that we are used to understanding. Most vaccines, what they actually do is they actually inject you with a diminished form of the disease, and that allows your body to build up an immunity to it, so that you will be able to to fight it off when that disease comes upon you. You'll have a better chance of being able to fight that off because your body has already been able to build up the immunity to it with a safer amount of the disease before it actually tries to attack you. But this vaccine is actually different. It uses mRNA, which of course stands for messenger RNA, and RNA is a ribonucleic acid. It uses RNA vaccine technology, which is slightly different than the vaccines that we're usually used to receiving. And now, I actually wanted to talk about what RNA is because I have a book by, and Nathan has the same book, I believe, by Maureen and Samuel Kondik, in which they actually describe what RNA is, but the description of RNA actually uses a lot of technical language, and so I didn't feel it would necessarily be very helpful to actually use their definition for what RNA is. Instead, I'm going to just post a link here to this article, which actually talks about RNA and what the RNA vaccine actually is. So those of you who want more information on this can actually do some more research to understand what the RNA vaccine actually does. So I'm just going to read one paragraph here real quick, which talks about it. And then you can find this article here, which you could read the entirety of at your leisure to understand it better. So here Well, okay, so this paragraph here says, for a classical vaccine, the antigen is introduced in the body to produce an immune response. However, in the case of DNA or RNA-based vaccines, no antigen is introduced, only the RNA or DNA containing the genetic information to produce the antigen. That is, for this specific class of vaccines, introduction of DNA and RNA provides the instructions to the body to produce the antigen itself. And that's in figure 1, which is right here on the screen. It says they can be injected in various ways, under the skin, in the vein, or in lymph nodes, and then they can enter our body cells. Those cells will use the RNA sequence of the antigen to synthesize the protein. After this step, the mechanism is similar to classical vaccines. The antigen is presented at the surface of a subset of cells and triggers the activation of specific cells of the immune system. And so here in figure 1, we see RNA vaccine technology. And RNA is injected in the body, which is at left. And then this RNA encodes the information to produce the antigen, which is a protein from a pathogen that will stimulate the immune system. Inside the cells, the RNA is used to synthesize the antigen, which is exposed to the cell surface in the middle. Then a subset of immune system cells recognizes the antigen and trigger an immune response, direct response, and long-term memory, which is at the right. So again, we're not doctors or scientists, so I'll leave this page up here for you to peruse at your leisure. But if I'm reading and understanding this correctly, it seems like one of the primary differences between the regular vaccines we usually get, like when you get your flu shot, and an RNA-based vaccine technology like the coronavirus vaccine, is that in the regular vaccine that you get, they actually introduce the disease into your body in a diminished safe amount so that your body can build up an immune response to it. But for the RNA vaccine, they don't introduce the actual pathogen itself. They actually basically train your body through the use of RNA and mRNA in order to be able to build up the immunity. So this actually means that while there are still the possibility of side effects like you get from any vaccine, I believe it's actually a safer way to get a vaccine than actually having the pathogen itself introduced into your body. So right. That's how I read and understand it. If there are doctors or scientists that come across this out there, you can of course let us know if we could be a bit more accurate with that. And so, like I said, I'm not going to try and talk about what RNA is because it's pretty technical, and there were some terms in there which we'd have to talk about, and that would lead to a lengthier program. So I'm just going to leave this here for anyone to peruse at their leisure later.
And it's also this will be good news to a lot of pro-life people who have been concerned about the possibility of fetal cells being used in vaccines. I remember actually we went to the March for Life this past year. There were groups that were out there sharing information about that and weren't exactly the friendliest about it, but it is an area of concern for a lot of pro-life people over the past year is, hey, should I be taking this vaccine? So now that we have the information on it, it doesn't really lead to any moral problems for pro-lifers.
Right. Yeah. So regardless of where you fall on the topic of vaccines and whether or not they use fetal cells, in this case with the coronavirus vaccine, you don't even have to worry about it because they're not using fetal cells. The question, if you feel like you don't want to use any vaccines that use fetal cells, this will be an uncontroversial way to get a vaccine. So that's good news for pro-life people.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving to our second topic is, of course, we've had the election going on, and President Trump is still in the battle, but it's looking more like Joe Biden is going to be the next president of the United States. And so, we're not going to talk about the election here. If you voted Trump or you voted Biden, you're welcome here. We hope this information is useful to you. But one of the controversial things that have sprung up is that, and this comes from an article, a doctor and medical ethicist argues life after 75 is not worth living, written by Stephen S. Hall. The controversy here is that Joe Biden is wanting to put Ezekiel Emanuel who is a bioethicist who believes that life after 75 is not worth living. He wants him on his coronavirus task force. And this, of course, has led to controversy because Dr. Emanuel believes that life after 75 is not worth living. Now, here's this article that I've posted in the show notes, which you can read later. But Emanuel wrote an article called Why I Hope to Die at 75, in which he outlines his position a lot more clearly. I didn't have a chance to read the full article, but I read a big portion of it. I read the entire article, excuse me, I read the entire MIT article here, but haven't had a chance to read the entire article from The Atlantic. But I did read a good portion of it. And so Dr. Emanuel is not promoting euthanasia. In fact, he states that he actually opposed the legalization of euthanasia and assisted suicide. So while he says that life after 75 is not worth living, what he means is that he doesn't think that you should be euthanized for being over 75. But what it does mean is he does not believe that you should use medical technology to extend your life if you're over 75. And this needs to be with a caveat too, because in his Atlantic article, he wrote near the end here that if someone wants to extend their lives, he doesn't oppose that, and he has shown people how to get medical care if they're over 75. But these last couple paragraphs here shows that he believes that he's speaking for himself here. In fact, I'll just go ahead and read these couple of paragraphs here. So when he's talking about actual medical policy here, he says this means, quote, "This means colonoscopies and other cancer screening tests are out, and before 75. If I were diagnosed with cancer now at 57, I would probably be treated unless the prognosis was very poor, but 65 will be my last colonoscopy. No screening for prostate cancer at any age. When a urologist gave me a PSA test, even after I said I wasn't interested and called me with the results, I hung up before he could tell me. He ordered the rest for himself. He ordered the test for himself, I told him, not for me. After 75, if I develop cancer, I will refuse treatment. Similarly, no cardiac stress test, no pacemaker, and certainly no implantable defibrillator. No heart valve replacement or bypass surgery. If I develop emphysema or some similar disease that involves frequent exacerbations that would normally land me in the hospital, I will accept treatment to ameliorate the discomfort caused by the feeling of suffocation, but will refuse to be hauled off. What about simple stuff? Flu shots are out. Certainly, if there were to be a flu pandemic, a younger person who has yet to live a complete life ought to get the vaccine or any antiviral drugs. A big challenge to antibiotics for pneumonia or skin and urinary infections. Antibiotics are cheap and largely effective in curing infections. It is really hard for us to say no. Indeed, even people who are sure they don't want life-extending treatments find it hard to refuse antibiotics. But, as Osler reminds us, unlike the decays associated with chronic conditions, death from these infections is quick and relatively painless, so no to antibiotics." End quote. So here we see that, talking for himself, he doesn't believe in any life-extending treatments, but he doesn't seem to oppose it if somebody else wants to get it. So it's really up in the air that Joe Biden wants to put someone on his coronavirus task force who believes life after 75 is not worth living. But he doesn't believe in euthanasia or assisted suicide for people after 75. And he seems to be okay with other people getting treatment, even if he doesn't want treatment. But this still raises some red flags. If he is on this coronavirus task force, what kind of policies will he be pushing for? Will he refuse to allow people after 75 to get treatment in favor of younger people getting treatment? What kinds of things will he be pushing for is really what's on people's minds, and is really what's kind of giving people pause about Dr. Emanuel here being put on the coronavirus task force.
Right. Yeah, that should actually raise a lot of red flags. If now there's a lot we can actually, I would say that we can agree with here is that we don't have an ethical obligation to sustain life at all costs. That natural death is something that we're all going to face one day. So at least in my opinion, I would think that he's hitting on something that I would agree with, is that, hey, yeah, if I have a chronic illness, I'm not going to try and extend my life at all costs, because eventually I am going to die someday. And honestly, as a Christian, I know that death is not the end, that it's only the beginning of
Right.
life in Christ. But if somebody disagrees, that's totally fine. But that should raise some red flags there, is if there's a bit of a utilitarian, at least from what I'm hearing, is there is a bit of a utilitarian view of human life, is that, well, life is really not worth living after 75. Well, what does he mean by worth? That's what I would like to know is, we have people out who are beyond the age of 75 who have contributed a lot. Two names that come to mind would be Betty White and Stan Lee, two very famous. Betty White is an actress, and then Stan Lee is a writer and also as an actor. They both contributed greatly even after age of 75. So I don't think that we should accept the conclusion that, after 75, your life isn't going to have any meaning. I mean, some elderly people have contributed a lot to other people's lives. So I'm not entirely sure. It seems to be that there's a very utilitarian view of life here that I think we could call into question and say, oh yeah, I might not be contributing much after 75. Well, why is that? Why my life has meaning in the first place is based on how much I can contribute to other people. And then also just this idea that, after age 75, we may not want to focus so much effort on helping people who get coronavirus at that age. I would also question that. I would just say, it's like, why is that the case? I mean, somebody might still value their life after age 75. So.
Yeah, he does talk about why life after 75 is not worth living.
Yeah.
And so this is from his Atlantic article here, where he talks about, where he says, doubtless death is a loss. It deprives us of experiences and milestones, of time spent with our spouse and children. In short, it deprives us of all the things we value. But here is a simple truth that many of us seem to resist. Living too long is also a loss. It renders many of us, if not disabled, then faltering and declining, a state that may not be worse than death, but is nonetheless deprived. It robs us of our creativity and ability to contribute to work, society, the world. It transforms how people experience us, relate to us, and most important, remember us. We are no longer remembered as vibrant and engaged, but as feeble, ineffectual, even pathetic. So he's so it sounds like he's concerned about the decay that all of us have to will one day have to go through when we reach an old enough life, and that there's certain our faculties are going to start failing us, our ability to reason is going to start failing us, and our ability really to care for ourselves is going to start failing us as well. So we as Christians believe that life is inherently valuable, and that human beings are valuable just because they're human. And the religious response, we're made in God's image, the non-religious response, that we have a rational nature that inheres in us and keeps us the same through all of our lives, through all of our changes. It's not an idea that is shared by Dr. Emanuel here. So there's also just kind of a different view of what makes life valuable. And this is something that we can go back throughout time and see, is that even in the ancient Greeks, they would say, they would view old age as something to be respected, and that the reason that we have kids is so that our children, just like we take care of them when they're children and unable to take care of themselves, our children grow up to be able to take care of us when we're too old to be able to take care of ourselves. And this is an idea that Christians can relate to as well, is that we have children, because one day they'll be able to help take care of us when we're too old to take care of ourselves. But it goes more than that, in that we view human life as inherently valuable, and we view people as inherently valuable. So we don't just have kids to have someone to take care of us when we get old, that although that is one thing that kids can do for us, but we also have kids because the more people that exist, the better. God loves people, and God wants us to be fruitful and multiply, that kind of thing. So there's that kind of thing as well. It's just a disagreement with Ezekiel Emanuel about what makes life valuable. He thinks if we can't contribute meaningfully to society or to each other, we no longer have a life that has value. And of course, we would say, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense, because we we're valuable based on the kind of thing that we are, not the kinds of things that we can contribute to others or to society. And we view old age as something that is to be respected because people, not only have they attained wisdom that comes through living life, but also we respect people. You don't have to die to be respected about for the things that you've done in your life. And so even if you're mentally and physically declining, we still respect you for the contributions that you've made in the past. In fact, that makes us more likely to want to care for you if you've made some kind of contribution, rather than if you've squandered your life.
Something that comes to mind, Chris Kaiser points out in his book, A Defense of Dignity, is that we need to differentiate between two types of dignity that people usually talk about. He talks about attributed dignity and intrinsic dignity. Then he talks about a third type, which would be dignity as flourishing. But what is touched on in the article here could be called attributed dignity. It's, maybe I grow up, I become an inventor, or I become a very famous writer, and I contribute a lot to other people's lives. Well, after age 75, theoretically, I develop a chronic illness and I no longer can do those things. Yeah, I might lose my attributed dignity, but as Chris Kaiser points out, I still have my intrinsic dignity based on what I am as a human being. Something else, when he said that, he goes, we're no longer going to be remembered as vibrant, young, and contributing to other people's lives, but as feeble and kind of helpless. That doesn't say much about a person of that age. It says more about the culture and the way the culture perceives them. I think about, cultures have differed in how they have viewed the elderly. Some cultures actually hold the elderly in a very high standard, or on a very high pedestal, saying that, hey, we can learn a lot from these people, from the wisdom they have gained and what they can teach us and what they've done in the past. So saying that, we view somebody at that age, at age 75 or age 85, as somebody who's feeble, or any of the other things he mentioned, that's more of a reflection of our view of them, and it's not really a reflection of them themselves and what they have to offer still. It says more about the mindset that we have, and our mindset can change based on the facts, and it should change based on the facts. Frankly, I think it's a good argument for being more open-minded about it and saying, hey, yeah, they can't do what I can't do right now, or excuse me, when I'm 85 years old, I won't be able to do what I can do right now as 25 years old. But what does that have to do with anything? I might be able to do other things. I might be able to do much more at that age than I would ever imagine myself doing right now while I'm 25. So I think it's just more of an argument to be more open-minded and say, hey, yeah, they can't do what they used to do, but so what? What does that matter in the first place? That's not why their life has meaning.
Yeah, and I just watched a panel with some conservative intellectuals, and O. Carter Snead was one of the folks on the panel, and he actually made a good observation. He said, he wonders if Dr. Ezekiel Emanuel knows that Joe Biden is 78, and if he's president of the United States, if he would allow President Biden to even receive the vaccine because he's over 75.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I actually was not familiar with Ezekiel Emanuel's work before being made aware of that article, and I checked with some colleagues also, and they hadn't really heard of him. One person had heard of him, Callum Miller, I think, was the one who sent this, and basically in the New England Journal of Medicine, Ezekiel Emanuel wrote an article called "Physicians, Not Conscripts: Conscientious Objection in Healthcare," in which Emanuel argues that professional societies should declare conscientious objection unethical. So he actually holds a bad view of conscientious objection also, which, if you're not familiar with the concept of conscientious objection in healthcare, it's just basically the position that if a doctor has moral problems with things like abortion and euthanasia, that they should not be forced to perform those procedures if they have ethical objections to it. So it's similar to conscientious objection in the military. Conscientious objection in healthcare is just that whether or not doctors ought to be forced to perform procedures that they have ethical objections to, like abortion and euthanasia. And so Ezekiel Emanuel joins the ranks of those like Julian Savulescu and Udo Schucklink, whose name I'm probably mispronouncing, but those two philosophers, as well as Ezekiel Emanuel, do not believe that doctors ought to be able to conscientiously object to procedures that they that they are ethically opposed to. And so that's really a discussion for another time. But Ezekiel Emanuel is one of those who does not believe that doctors ought to be able to conscientiously object. Okay, so a third topic that we have for discussion here, and this is one that I'm reading from National Review, which of course is a news site that leans more conservative, but this is another one that was written by Wesley Smith, and this one is about how the Polish High Court outlaws abortion for fetal disability. So we're kind of running the gamut of bioethics here on this program. First, we have abortion and fetal cells in vaccines, and then we move to whether or not life is worth living after 75 and conscientious objection, and now we're talking about abortion for fetal disability, and we're going to talk about eugenics here in a moment. So this program really kind of runs the gamut of bioethic concerns here.
All right.
So, okay, so the article here from Wesley Smith says, Poland has traditionally outlawed most abortions, except for those obtained due to fetal abnormality or to save the life or health of the mother. Now, the Constitutional Tribunal, Poland's highest court, has ruled that abortion obtained because of fetal disability is unconstitutional. From the New York Times story. In the ruling, the tribunal's president, Julia Przylebska, said that allowing abortions in cases of fetal abnormality legalized, quote, eugenic practices with regard to an unborn child, thus denying it the respect and protection of human dignity, end quote. Because the Polish... hold on for a second. My computer was kind of wigging out there for a moment. Okay, let's try this again.
Audience, I will just mention we are professional amateurs.
Yeah, let's try this again. I don't know what was going on there with my laptop. Odd. Let's see. That's really odd. Okay, well, I'm going to stop sharing for a moment then, because for some reason the screen share doesn't like this article. I don't know if it's an ad that comes up or not, or that was causing it to wig out like that. But anyway, so I'll go ahead and read this again. This is from the New York Times story. Quote, in the ruling, the tribunal's president, Julia Przylebska, said that allowing abortions in cases of fetal abnormality legalized, quote, eugenic practices with regard to an unborn child, thus denying it the respect and protection of human dignity, end quote. Because the Polish constitution guarantees a right to life, she added, terminating a pregnancy based on the health of the fetus amounted to, quote, a directly forbidden form of discrimination, end quote. So that was from the New York Times. And so Wesley Smith continues in his article. In other words, the court treated the unborn child as a human being deserving of the same equal rights as people who are born. Fetal abnormality was the reason for most of Poland's 1,110 legal abortions in 2019, so this ruling could save the lives of children diagnosed with Down syndrome, dwarfism, and other genetic conditions. Most non-Polish news stories about the case focused on the quote, angry, end quote, protests that erupted in the decision's wake, with some critics of the decision worrying that more women will have to leave Poland for an abortion, which more than 100,000 already do each year. The only way the case could be overturned would be to amend the Polish constitution, which requires a 2/3 majority vote of the people. Poland is a pro-life country, one of the few in the West, so that isn't likely, at least in the near term. And that's the end of Wesley Smith's article there. So just to briefly recap, the Polish High Court has outlawed abortion because their constitution guarantees a right to life, and allowing abortion for the case of fetal abnormality is discriminatory against fetuses with health issues like Down syndrome, dwarfism, things like that. And so because this was an unjust form of discrimination, the Polish High Court has outlawed it, which of course has led to protests from pro-choice organizations who are upset that more women are going to have to leave Poland to have abortions.
You know, I think we need to make an observation about the protests, because Poland still allows abortions in the case of when the mother's life is in danger or for rape or incest. The mass protests with hundreds of thousands of people taking to the street to protest, I think it kind of shows what a sham some typical pro-choice arguments are. Because, for example, we always, from hardcore activists, we always get the question, it's like, oh, well, what about in the case of rape, or what about in the case of life of the mother? Well, in Poland, they are still allowing that, and pro-choice organizations are still fighting tooth and nail. So at least in some cases, it's true that it's just a smokescreen. It's just a way to say, hey, let's make the pro-lifer look as bad as possible. And it's saying, well, politically, we're still allowing these, but people are still protesting about it. So it was never really about those hard cases to begin with. It was more about, I have a right to have an abortion if, for whatever reason, I deem necessary. And that's why I think we're seeing a lot of these protests, is because people are more upset about losing the right to abortion rather than about the circumstances surrounding abortion in the first place.
Yeah. And, one question that came up in my mind as I was reading that is, what exactly took them so long? If this is unjust discrimination to abort fetuses with deformities, then why are they just now outlawing it? Now, I'm not saying they shouldn't. I'm just saying it's about time. Because if you're going to argue that you should abort a fetus because it has Down syndrome or because it has dwarfism or something like that, well, it's kind of inexplicable as to why we shouldn't just kill people who are alive today that have these issues. Because
right.
if you deem these issues not worth living, such that you're willing to kill someone who has these issues, well, that would be inconsistent. I would say that serves as a hard case for pro-choice people as to, if you believe we should kill fetuses that have these issues, then why should we not kill people who are outside the womb who also have these issues? So
right. And and I really have to ask, what kind of message does that send to the rest of the world, and especially people who are disabled around the world, and saying that your life is not worth living because you have a disability, but I don't have a disability, and I'm going to tell you your life is not worth living? What kind of message does that send? Like, right. I mean, do people stop and think about this and say, it's like, hey, yeah, maybe I'm being a jerk about this, and saying that, yeah, I don't know what it's like to have that disability. So I should probably be a little more careful with what I'm saying about that. I also have to laugh. I saw some comments about this online, and people were saying that, oh, we're gonna stand up to this government here. The Polish women have now been mobilized. And my thought came to mind was, Poland was occupied by both the Soviets during the Cold War and Nazi Germany during World War II. But this is what it took to get people out into the streets to fight? Really? Like, come on. I mean, you can't have an abortion, so that's making you much more angry than Soviet oppression or Nazi oppression. Come on, really?
Right. Yeah. So we would consider that good news out of Poland. And it's not very specific on what kinds of health issues would justify abortion. The article said that 100,000 Polish women leave Poland every year to go have an abortion. But here in the United States, we have our health exception was defined so broadly in the Doe v. Bolton case that there's generally no reason that a woman cannot have an abortion if she can at any point through all 9 months, if she can convince her doctor that it's that it's for her health, whether it be financial health, familial health, emotional or mental health, etc. She can have an abortion if she can convince the doctor. And some late-term abortionists, like Warren Hearn, who practices in Boulder, Colorado, believes that if a woman doesn't want a pregnancy, that's a health concern. So he'll do an abortion on anyone, essentially.
And there is a myth that abortions after viability only happen for health cases. And we actually, it's interesting when you look at the actual medical literature on this. So I have a book on my shelf right now, Abortion Care by Samuel Rowlands. He's a British abortionist, and it's a medical textbook on how to perform abortions. And he actually makes the point in the book on page 144. He says, if you don't use feticide like potassium chloride or digoxin to make sure the fetus is killed, in a case where there is no fetal abnormality, you run the risk of having a child born alive if the abortion takes place after viability. And then he goes on to say that, if the child is born alive, get them to a hospital as quick as you can and get them the best medical care that you can. So this whole idea that abortions after viability or even that late in pregnancy are only for cases where there's severe health problems, it's a complete myth, and people aren't even aware of the literature on that issue.
Right. And so the last story that I wanted to touch on here, and I'll go ahead and share the screen. Hopefully Hopefully my laptop won't wig out again.
We'll try this again.
Yeah. I don't know if it was just an ad that was causing that or what, but here we go. Okay, so this is an article from the Los Angeles Times. For those of you who are not local, Los Angeles, well, you've probably heard of Los Angeles, but Los Angeles Times is a newspaper in LA. And so the article is called UC Berkeley is disavowing its eugenic research fund after bioethicists and other faculty call it out. This is written by Teresa Watanabe. And so a bioethics professor at UC Berkeley, Osagi K. Obasogi, and again, I may be butchering that name, but he received a campus email about a research fund available. Oh, there it goes. Okay, so so he. So I'll just stop. I'll just kind of summarize everything here. But he received a campus email about a research fund available to faculty members of UC Berkeley, and UC Berkeley is a somewhat well-known college here in California. It's up in the Bay Area, if I'm not mistaken. But essentially, the Genealogical Eugenic Institute Fund supports research and education in eugenics, which was a field discredited after World War II as a horrifying ideology that sought to use science to improve the human race by promoting traits deemed superior and breeding out those judged undesirable. The judgments aligned strongly with social biases that favored white, able-bodied, and financially stable people. And so it was a justification for Hitler's Nazi Germany to kill 6 million Jewish people and the U.S. authorities to forcibly sterilize more than 60,000 people in California and more than 30 other states, largely in the early 20th century. So obviously, this is not something that a college, especially a progressive college, would want to be associated with. And yet Berkeley's Eugenic Research Fund has been active. It's a $2.4 million fund that offers an annual payout of about $70,000 in fiscal year 2020 to support research and education on policies, practices, and technologies that could, quote, affect the distribution of traits in the human race, end quote, including those related to family planning, infertility, assisted reproduction technologies, prenatal screening, abortion, gene editing, and gene modification, the email said. That, quote, modern definition of eugenics, end quote, included, quote, perspectives that shed light on not only the benefits but also the limitations and the ethics of these alternative approaches to improving the human race, end quote. And so the article goes on to talk about how Obasogi was shocked and dismayed that this thing is still going on. So so obviously this is not something that the college is going to want to be associated with, and so I don't think the article actually says what they're going to do with the fund now that this has kind of come to light, but there are certain people who are talking about how it's wrong to continue accepting the money based on the history behind what the fund is for. And now, as I got about halfway down the article, I was starting to think, well, I wasn't sure about their claim that eugenics has been largely discredited after World War II, because eugenics still goes on today, just in a different form. For example, with in vitro fertilization, when you conceive embryos artificially in the womb, you're performing eugenics on those embryos because you have to look at their genetics to see which ones have the greatest chance of survival, and then you implant them into the woman's womb. And as we learn more and more about what kinds of genetic markers to look for, we can start selecting out embryos that have favorable traits and that have less favorable traits. We can get rid of those and only implant the ones that have traits that are more acceptable to us. And I was starting to think of that as I was reading through this article, but to my surprise, what's the term I'm looking for? It was a happy surprise, essentially, was that this article in the Los Angeles Times actually talks about those kinds of eugenics that are still going on. Although apparently some people call them newgenics, not eugenics. But right. I hadn't heard that term before. But it's still something that goes on even today. That we have cases of eugenics going on. They're not as as known, and a lot of people don't have a great issue with them because they're going on with human embryos. But it's the same kind of thing that went on in Nazi Germany, where they talked about how Jews were not persons, and so they could justify doing all sorts of experiments on them. And today, we don't consider embryos to be persons, and so we're able to do all sorts of experiments on them through in vitro fertilization and other things. So eugenics is still going on; it just takes a different form. But UC Berkeley has basically said that it's not good for us to continue to take funds that go toward these that has such a history of eugenics behind it.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I seem to remember when I read the article, it said that this fund had been around for decades. I
believe so.
I really have to wonder who at UC Berkeley was looking past this and saying, hey, yeah, there's no problem with it. And, it's pretty sad that a school as prestigious as UC Berkeley would allow that to slip by and say, hey, and nobody asked a question until now saying, hey, something's up with this. Why do we have this eugenics fund when we know what eugenics is? I have to wonder how many people actually do know what eugenics was. And it goes way back to the 19th century with quote unquote scientific racism and racial theories of crime and offending, where scientists like Cesar Lombroso in the United States had said, hey, there are genetic defects in different people and different races that lead to social pathologies like crime, like poverty, and like a lack of education. And that's what created a lot of the biases in the sciences that led to eugenics and helped create the eugenics movement in the United States that Margaret Sanger and some of the early founders of Planned Parenthood were associated with. And actually, a lot of very prominent scholars at the time in the early 20th century were affiliated with the eugenics movement. People like H.G. Wells, if I'm not mistaken, he was also affiliated with it, science fiction writer and British scholar. I think it's very easy because given that the fund was couched in very academic sounding language that had, Hendrik van der Breggen points out in his book, he goes, with a euphemism, you can hide the truth just by using a very calm sounding word. And I think that's what happened here was the fund was going around saying, oh yeah, this is what it's all for family planning and for research. It's like, yeah, what kind of research are we talking about here? We're talking about ethical research because it doesn't sound like it. And I'm glad that the bioethicist, he spoke up and he caught that and was able to call it out.
Right. And speaking of Hendrik van der Breggen, we recently interviewed Hendrik on our podcast, on our audio only podcast. And so if you don't listen to the audio only podcast, we encourage you to check it out. Hendrik van der Breggen actually recently wrote or published a book, Untangling Popular Pro-Choice Arguments, and we interviewed him on our podcast, which you'll only be able to hear on the audio only podcast because we weren't able to get him on the video portion.
Right.
So if you listen to the podcast, you can look for that in the next few weeks. If you don't listen to the podcast, check it out. We're on iTunes, and also you can find us on Blog Talk Radio /pro-life thinking. As for that, those are the issues from the past couple of weeks that really stuck out to us, and so yeah. Now, if you listen to this video, you'll have a better idea of these issues and a better understanding of why some of these turn out to be controversial. So, if you found this discussion helpful, then feel free to share us around social media, Facebook, Twitter, wherever. And if you are able to help become a financial supporter, Greg Cunningham of Center for Bioethical Reform says that there are more people working full-time to kill unborn babies than there are working full-time to save them. If you have the means and you would like to become a financial supporter of the podcast, you can go to prolifetraining.com and click on donate on the menu on the top, and then you can send a donation there. Make sure to put my name in the notes section so Life Training Institute knows to put your donation into my account, and donations are also tax deductible. So with that, we hope you have a great rest of the day, and we'll see you next time.